So today's video is going to pick up where the last one left off, and there'll be a little bit of overlap because in the two different sections I addressed totemism in one case pretty thoroughly and in the other one not so much. And the previous video just talked about it a little bit. So I'm going to come back to it because I think it's very important to understand that this is both an individual and communal way to connect to spirits that supports you spiritually. And I think the real key here is to think about not only how the individual connects to spirits in the world around them, and obviously this is completely tied into animism. If you believe the world around you is infused with spirit, then you're going to try to connect to those spirits. And the larger animals obviously have larger spirit and tend to be the ones that are focused on, in terms of group totems particularly, meaning tribal totems. So there are three types of totems. There is a tribal totem, which is the group totem. And I would really like to see if the cohort or even the class can come up with a totem that speaks to your general identity. My experience in the past has been that classes who've been able to generate totems and actually begin to worship them in some way generate stronger senses of cohesion. And for example, last year we had a panda totem that was very, very powerful, and there were poems written to the panda, and the panda began to emerge in all aspects of work. There were prayers written to the panda, there were rituals that developed around it. I mean, basically it became a form of religious practice. I'm not asking you to do all of that, but if you start with a totem, the other things start to come afterwards, which is interesting enough. So I think religion in many ways has its origins in totemism, because totems are collective symbols that represent both God and society. So if you think about that for a second, not God in the traditional sense, but the spirit maybe is a better way of looking at it. So totemism is really largely symbolic. It stands both for the society and for the connection to something bigger. It also speaks to the sense of time and ancestor worship. So if you look at the totem poles in the Northwest, for example, they began to be built and constructed just as the Native American peoples in that area were really under threat. So it was almost like a way of building a marker to the civilization, almost like a gravestone before the death had actually occurred. And it was a way to remember not just the people. You don't see people as much as you do spirits. And these were the spirits of the ancestors that were carried down through the individuals. So if you had a spirit animal that was individual to you and it was connected to your grandfather as well, and to your great-grandfather or grandmother down the line, that would give you a greater sense of not only your spirit connection to the animal world, but also to your own clan and society. So there are three types of totems. There are the clan totems, the individual totems, and the gender totems. So women and men sometimes would have different totems within a tribe as well. So there was an awful lot here that connected ancestor worship, animism, and totemism together. Now, interestingly enough, you see examples of totems in mascots, in the way that people dress for NFL games. They're frequently dressed as the animal or the object of their team. And this is done collectively, particularly when it involves makeup. And this is very interestingly tied back to early religious practice where people would put on makeup or they would dress themselves as the totem. And they would collectively develop rituals around it. So you see this in football games. Even soccer crowds do the same thing. And Emil Durkheim, who is a famous sociologist, and those of you who've taken sociology may have already studied him, says that basically whenever a society is worshiping a divine form, it's also worshiping itself. So the worship of the totem reinforces the moral structures. It reinforces the requirements of the society to behave religiously in a certain way, which I think is an interesting thing to think about. The final part of religious practice early on, and this is not in the original list, but it certainly is an important addition, so I'm going to include it here, is the importance of sacrifice. Now, when you think of sacrifice, you usually think of sacrificing of animals or even people, But really, if you look at the lower right, and you can see there's a statue of the Buddha with a lot of fruit and some flowers in front of him. It's a little hard to see because the picture's small. But this is more typical. Usually sacrifice is offering something to the gods in the form of something animate, like a fruit or a vegetable, or at least something that's alive, that is something that you would otherwise use, that you're giving over to the gods. So it's a form of giving something of yourself that you would otherwise use over to the gods as a form of sacrifice. That's a basic form of sacrifice. More extreme forms of sacrifice include the sacrificing of animals. And the sacrificing of animals really starts in the Neolithic period, and we'll get more into what that means, but basically it's the period where religions begin to develop into more the belief in a high god, and you're giving over the animal to that high god. So if you look, for example, at the Greeks there, they are sacrificing either a goat or a ram of some kind. You can see there's a sacrificial altar. Usually the sacrifice is done by drawing blood first and then killing the animal, and that both the blood and the body of the animal is given to the god. That might sound familiar to you if you are a Christian, because again, when you are taking the blood and body of Christ, you are literally taking the form of a human sacrifice. Christ sacrifices himself, Jesus sacrifices himself for the salvation of humanity. And in the taking of that sacrament, in the ritual communion, you are taking the blood and the body of that ritual sacrifice yourself. And in some ways, it's almost like the relationship between the believer and God is reversed, where God sacrifices himself and the believer takes that sacrifice in themselves as a symbolic and literal connection to their God. So there's a lot of elements of sacrifice. The human sacrifice piece of it, and for those of you who are in F block and want to know why I said this justifies, I think it's said something like this justifies human sacrifice, or some ways I excused it. What I was trying to say ineffectively was that human sacrifice, if you believe that the God is in need of some sort of gift, or that you need to give something of yourself or of your people to that God, then it makes sense, right? You're giving something of a lower quality to something of a higher quality. And that's not to justify it from a human rights perspective, but again, that's the way it was understood. So when the Aztecs did it, they did it with people who were prisoners of war. So in some ways, it was also a retribution against their enemies. So the point is, sacrifice also is something you see very early on in early religions. So what I'm going to ask you to do here is to think about these three things: totemism, sacrifice, and ancestor worship. And we'll come back to this a little bit, but how does each one of them in some ways reinforce the sense of community, and how does it help to structure the religion? And I'm going to come back with another video to build on this, but that's a starting point. So if you want to write something and stop for a minute and maybe write a short paragraph on this, why don't you do that? And then you can watch the next video when you're done.